Hello and welcome to Haman Nature. On this crossover episode with the great Bob Murphy, we talk about energy a whole bunch and a little bit about climate change and a little bit about property rights. Um, with the new incoming Trump administration, what kinds of energy policy can we expect? What can we hope for? I asked Bob what advice he would give if you were able to whisper in the ears of powerful people who set policy. And we also talk a lot about what energy production and distribution would look like in a much, much more libertarian future if we could ever get there. This one's an awful lot of fun, so enjoy.
Haman Nature, a journey in search of a peaceful and prosperous society with human nature as a guide. Led by your host, Adam Haman.
Hi, Bob.
Hey, Adam.
How are you doing, sir?
I am doing well.
I'm fascinated by energy, and I wanted to ask you some questions. So, assuming he can manage to not get assassinated here in the next couple months, Donald Trump is going to take office, and presumably we're going to get some fairly significant changes in energy policy. And I thought since you've done a lot of work in this area, you might have some things to say.
Sure thing. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't have any inside information as to what he's doing. This administration, the guy that he's picked to that's going to be his cabinet post. He has a funny guy like they. I think I took out a funny billboard or something. If people want to go look that up, in terms of pushing back on some company it was like a clothing company that was anti-oil, and then they took out a billboard just showing that, well, no, actually our product is used in your product or something like that. So anyway, he seems like a kind of a funny guy. I will say, last time around, in terms of Trump had a lot of big talk and whatever, and then people think, oh, okay, but once he gets in there, and the area where he clearly did way more than I thought he was going to do was on energy policy, in terms of being radical, in the sense of putting people in, like people that I knew that were being put into, coming out of the think tank world and getting appointed to positions in the Department of Energy or, other related areas. And so I am hopeful this time around too, that it's going to be fairly radical in that sense as well. And also just, him withdrawing from the, Paris Accords, like that. That's not something like a George W. Bush would have done.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, that was really, I don't want to say inconceivable, but I could not believe that he went that far. As far as more technical things, one issue that they do is the discount rate that's used inside of these models in terms of the government. So that's just a little inside baseball, but I think it's kind of interesting that the Office of Management and Budget, they have guidelines as to, if you're going to do a cost-benefit analysis for some proposed government program, you got to use certain discount rates.
Yeah.
Okay. Because it's things happen in different times. Like some regulation that's going to insist that businesses have better insulation or something. Like higher standards on insulation or higher energy efficiency standards, and then you got to quantify. Well, what's the benefit of that, or the trade? So it costs more up front, but then it reduced energy costs going forward. And so to be able to compare those two, you have to know, well, how do we compare an expenditure today with, reduced heating bill 10 years from now? You got to know how to discount that. So anyway, there were guidelines in place as to how you should treat those costs. And I think off the top of my head, I think it was 7% and 3% were the numbers they gave, and said you should show both. And the problem was with this climate change literature, if you used a 7% discount rate, that the social cost of carbon was negative. Okay, meaning, at least with one of the models they use, I should put that way. All right, so they used three models technically, and with one of them, and the idea was that for a range of global warming, it actually improved, humanity. It showered positive benefits. And then there was a point, that peaks, and then for further warming after that point. But the idea was, just given the way the model worked for, earlier decades, the warming, the benefits were upfront. And so if you discounted at a 7% rate, then like all the goodies come up front and then the problems come down. Anyway, so I'm just saying it was just funny that popped out. So clearly they didn't want that. And it just turned out that they wanted to use a discount rate that was lower than what the two, levels were that the standard OMB guidelines showed. And so they would have assessments of like, here's the savings of, this program. And they would have, they would want to throw in the climate benefits, like some new government rule that's going to reduce CO2 emissions. And so like, how do we justify that and say, oh, well, here's the cost in terms of reduced economic output, but then the benefit. And one of the things they wanted to throw in the benefit column was reduced climate change damages decades down the road. And then they would show it for like the 3%, and then there'd be an asterisk, and you look at the bottom and say, actually, we're not using a 3% rate here or something like that. So anyway, I'm just saying it was, they weren't following their own model. So that was one of the things that the Trump administration did, was they were going to recompute the social cost of carbon at what they thought were the more appropriate discount rates. And so anyway, that's like a technical inside baseball thing, but it was just funny to show how much of this stuff, I guess what I'll end with on this little train of thought is the people talking about, oh, you got to follow the science and all that stuff. All the stuff with global warming and climate change, you can make it look like it's a disaster, or you can make it look like it's just going to be a little blip based on the discount rate you use. Like you can stipulate all the other stuff, and partly that's because a lot of these leading models, it's like, oh, in the year 2100, if there's climate change, that means instead of being, 300% richer, humans will only be 280% richer. You know what I mean? I'm making those numbers up, but that's kind of the thing that it is. And so, when you couch it like that, it's not anyway. So that's some of the issues. So in terms of changes, in terms of personnel and like internal policies, there could be things like that. But then beyond that, the big picture is just allowing for the development of a lot of federal land, like meaning literally land, but also offshore deposits of oil and natural gas. A lot of that is not currently being developed. And so the Trump the second time around, they could really open that up. And I don't know if you want to get into it, Adam, but just to give an idea of, well, I'll stop there. I know I've been speaking a lot, but at some point I want to just go through some of the inventory of what they think the U.S. has in terms of these resources.
Yeah, I definitely do. So the guy you're talking about that Trump picked to head the Department of Energy, I guess it is, this Chris Wright, he's an oil industry exec, CEO. And yeah, he is interesting. He got famous a couple years ago for going on camera and drinking the solution that's used in fracking, just to show that it's like harmless or something, because people were worried about. There's a little mini documentary where they're lighting, people are opening up their taps in their kitchen and lighting the water on fire and blaming it on fracking.
You gonna trust Matt Damon or this guy?
Yeah, that's the thing. And yeah, I was looking up at him, looking him up a little bit before we spoke here, and he looks pretty good. Obviously, he's pro fossil fuel, which great. I think he's pro nuclear too. He thinks the climate change science is mostly a bunch of hooey, and that's music to my ears. So yeah, I'm wondering. I want to go through what you think a different energy policy could be achieved in a Trump administration. Go through those assets you were just mentioning, but I'm also curious. There's a regime uncertainty problem here because you have to spend a whole bunch of money, to extract these resources. And how do you convince companies that this policy just isn't going to change on a dime 4 years later? The Exxon pipeline problem and all of that. How do you? Is there a way that that you could lock policy in so that it can't just be reversed on a dime or something?
Right. So I think probably first we can go through some of the numbers here just to give people an idea. And this is partly, I don't know if this is still something that they stress, Adam, but I know growing up it was like we have to reduce our reliance on foreign oil because we're going to just run out of oil. And that's why everyone needs to drive electric cars. And I think they pivoted from that. Now it's more just climate change. And perhaps the reason is that the U.S. is not about to run out of oil. So here, I'm just going to summarize some of the results, and I encourage you folks to check this out. It's the title of this document is the North American Energy Inventory. It's put out by the Institute for Energy Research, where I used to work. So I was not involved in this particular one because I haven't been there in a few years. But anyway, it's all very credible sources, at least as far as this stuff goes. You know what I mean? They're not going to the Heritage Foundation or the Cato Institute and saying, hey, what do you think the number is? You know, they're relying on standard government reports of this stuff. So the U.S. oil resources, for example, there are 1,657 billion barrels. So that's more than a trillion barrels of technically recoverable oil. The EIA estimates that there are 44 billion barrels that are approved oil reserves. All right, so those are different tiers of, oil that like they think is out there versus stuff that they, have developed and they can know, we can extract this with a certain degree of certainty. And so at our current rate of consumption, the United States has 227 years of oil supply from technically recoverable oil resources. Additionally, the U.S. has 369 years of supply at a 50% recovery rate in our current rate of consumption in terms of, like the broader category of oil that they think is out there, but they're not exactly sure, the extraction of feasibility and so on. Let me just give you one more. At the current consumption rate, there's 20 years of natural gas from proved reserves and 130 years from technically recoverable resources. All right. So, and with coal, it's likewise. So I won't go through and read the numbers, but the point is they have at least a century worth of those three just, in the U.S. And then if you broaden it to Canada and Mexico, it's even more. All right. So the point is that there's no issue of the U.S. having to wean itself from dependence on fossil fuels because, we rely on the Middle East or things like that. Like that's just, and again, I don't know, is that resonating with you, Adam, that weren't you brought up to think we were on the verge of running out of this stuff and that's why we got to switch to renewables?
Yeah, for sure. In the 70s and 80s, that was the headline.
Yeah. And so
do you think, was that just propaganda? I mean, misinformation, or were they just wrong or not thinking about it right? Or
okay, so one issue is the issue of like proved reserves. So we don't know exactly where the oil is, right? Like if you've seen the movie There Will Be Blood, right? So that's kind of shows that there's there's some skill involved and so forth, and so at any given time, like if you ask all the oil company executives and their people, like, hey, where are you going to get oil over the next 5 years from? And they can talk about, here, and this and how. At some point, if you said, okay, but then where? Once that well runs dry, then what do you get? At some point, they would say, well, we don't know yet. You know what I mean? Because it's not, you only have a certain amount that you've gone out and dug the wells and gotten that supply ready and identified because it costs money to go drill wells. And so what happened is, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but if you looked at as of 1980, if you went to like the statistical abstract of the United States and said, what are the proven reserves of crude oil left? It would be some number. And then if you said, okay, and how much are we consuming per year? And that would be, if you divided the two, there would be like 35 years of oil left. And so then you say, okay, but more than 35 years so like the world ran out of oil, right? And right now we have no oil left. And no, that's not the case. In fact, the proven reserves are higher now than they were in 1980, even though humans have consumed a lot of oil in the interim. Okay, so the analogy I've used is to say it's like if a kid goes to the pantry in his house and he looks at the toilet paper on the shelf, and he's like doing the guys at our current rate of consumption, we're going to run out of toilet paper in 3 days. And it's like, right. And then once that happens, we go to the store and we buy more. And so likewise, when the available, when the located known supplies or what's called proved reserves starts dwindling, either because of, that, but combined with like if consumption goes up, then it becomes profitable on the margin to go out and explore more and locate more and, get the procedure and, the wheels in motion to start developing new wells. So I don't know if am I getting that across? Like, so at any given time, it would be wasteful to go identify the next 60 years worth of oil that we're going to develop.
Yeah. And they can't see the size of the pantry or the size of the store. They can't tell where the bottom is. It's unknown, and we haven't gone looking for it. As you were talking, though, a question occurred to me. When they're calculating these numbers, do they take into account, like, would the numbers change if they assumed a higher price for oil or changes in the cost of extraction? Do they?
Right. Yeah. So great question. And so that's part of those different categories of the proven reserves versus technically recoverable and things like that. So that's why, if you caught, I blew through that fast, but it was like at a 50% extraction rate, then it threw out a number. And so the idea is that technically recoverable, as the name suggests, is saying, like in terms of human ability, we could go get all this oil, but at some point with the technically recoverable reserves, it might not be economical to do it based on the world price of oil. Okay, and so that's why I was saying for that particular stat that I threw out at a 50% recovery rate, saying let's assume the world price of oil is such that it'll, it's profitable to go get 50%. Another way of pointing it out is to say, when people say, are we ever going to run out of oil? That's not really the question, right? That at some point, oil would become so expensive on the margin that you would just switch away and use something else. It's not that literally the last drop of available crude would be burned. That's probably not the way it would happen.
Yeah, it's so frustrating. People think we need a legislation to make us switch away from a dwindling energy source into a more sustainable one or whatever. But just if you leave the markets alone, that's what prices do. You don't need a heavy-handed policy. Just let the market work.
Can I tell you a cool thing?
Please.
Do I have your permission? Okay. We can at least do one cool thing per episode, right? So it's this neat thing with Harold Hotelling was the person that developed this in terms of the, I forget what he called it, something like the economics of an exhaustible resource or something like that. And it was, so the idea is what's the optimal consumption rate? And so you can simplify it, but let's just say all the world's oil was just like in this big pool. It was just, sitting in some reservoir that was owned, and then the idea is, well, how would we develop it? Because on the one hand, well, gee, if we burn it all today, then there's no oil next year. But on the other hand, if we don't burn any today, thinking, oh, we got to save it for the future, well, then they're going to think that next year too, and so then no one ever touches it, and that seems kind of dumb. And so, he came up with the economic logic of it and saying, okay, if you're the owner of this thing, what's the spot price of oil today? And then you say, okay, so on the margin, do I want to sell one more barrel, recover one more barrel, put it in a physical barrel and sell it, or keep it in my reservoir and carry it to next year? And on the margin, the trade-off is if I sell it today, I get the spot price. I can then buy a bond with that and earn the rate of interest. And then the spot price of crude has to rise. And so the idea is you consume it and develop it such that as the supply is dwindling, then that makes the spot price rise over time. And it's got to be the case in equilibrium that, like if the going rate of interest is 5%, then the spot price of oil rises 5% a year. And that's what makes you indifferent. And so anyway, there's a lot of simplifying assumption there. Obviously you can tweak that and make it more realistic, but
sure,
that was the idea. And it kind of works, right? That means the higher the interest rate, it's like the more impatient people are.
Yeah.
So you would consume more today, right? Because then that means like if the interest rate's 20%, then in equilibrium, the spot price of the oil rises 20%. So that means that, the quantity hitting the market shrinks over time more rapidly. And so that's why the price goes up and oil becomes scarcer more quickly, if you get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And that kind of lines up, right? Like the more impatient people are, they should consume more of the oil earlier. Whereas if the interest rate's really low and time preference is really low, then you very slowly draw down the oil, and it kind of, more of the pool is carried forward to future decades. So the other neat thing about that is it's showing, contrary to popular belief, markets are perfectly capable of taking into account future generations. Right? That's kind of like the bootstrapping. It's not like you got to live. It's like, yeah, you could be on your deathbed, and then you, as part of your estate, have this pile of oil, this pond of oil that you've been carrying over the decades, and drawing it down at the optimal rate, and then you hand it. So anyway, that's just a kind of neat little thing just to show that markets actually do work and prices communicate information.
Yes, they do. Yeah, so like if you were in the ear of Trump or this Chris Wright guy, and you could, have some influence on what policy would be, I'm curious what you would say. And a related but also wildly different subject, if we had a pure market economy, no monopolistic government at all, what do you think our energy situation would look like? It wouldn't look anything like what we have, right?
Right. Okay, so I mean the optimal solution would be complete privatization.
Yeah.
Right? They get the government out of it, sell it to everybody, sell it to private owners. That I could see someone saying that's not realistic,
Sure.
especially if a lot of this stuff is like on government owned land and you're not, so okay, so failing that, okay, at least allow for leasing and do it that way. Have we talked, Adam, about, I know I've talked with other people about this, but did we ever talk about the thing with, I got so frustrated with Nancy Pelosi and the response that the Republicans gave to her? Is that ringing a bell, or does it sound new?
I don't think so, no.
Okay, so strap in, folks. This is a riveting story. So the reason I know that is because like I was involved in this, and like the Democrats would come out and say something, and then the Republicans would hit back, and I was working for the Institute for Energy Research, and I was helping craft what our position was. So anyway, it was I don't remember if it was the Obama administration or if it was Trump, but there was a proposal because gas prices were high, and so that one of the things was people saying, hey, why don't we increase leasing and develop more U.S. oil? It reduces our reliance. It kind of dovetailed with a lot of talking points. Like you could say, hey, you don't want to have reliance on the Middle East. Well, we got a ton of oil sitting here at home. Why don't we develop that? And then we'll, good jobs and and tax revenue and so it'll reduce the deficit. And so one of the things the Democrats pushed back against that was they said, oh no, we went and surveyed it, and statistically speaking, for all these leasing rights that are sold off to the private sector, in practice, the oil companies only actually end up with it working, well in, I'm making this number, it's like 1.3% of the cases, or something like that. All right, so that might not be the number, but the point was, don't think that this is actually going to reduce gas prices, because these oil companies, they buy the rights to lease the oil, and they drill some exploratory wells, and then they actually don't ever end up producing too much. And so the Republicans understandably were pushing back against that and going, well, right, because they don't know where the oil is. So they have to drill a bunch of test wells, and then when they hit pay dirt, that's where they develop it, and that's why the statistic is what you're saying. But you got to give them the chance to look, to figure out what, what I mean? So they were giving her the honest, correct answer. And I was saying, no, guys, there's an even easier one. Nancy Pelosi is saying oil companies are going to send billions of dollars to Washington and then not emit more CO2. And she's saying, no, we don't want your money. You get what I'm saying? Like if she were correct and the oil companies really were just writing checks and then like, haha, we're not going to bring more oil to market, screw you, that would be the best of all possible worlds from her point of view.
Right.
And so why don't we just call her bluff and say, okay, you're exactly right. So tell us why we're not taking the oil companies' money if they're not even going to emit more CO2. But it's just, how Washington, like if Nancy Pelosi says one thing, we have to disagree with every clause in her sentence. And so anyway, I was upset about that. But so that was...
It is usually the right instinct to reject
Yes.
every single syllable she utters.
Yeah. So anyway, my point is that they could certainly do that. And I don't know if in a minute if you want to talk about the climate change issue, but certainly they could do that. That infrastructure's up and running, and there were huge discrepancies in, like the George Bush administration, then to the Obama administration, and then to Trump in terms of like the leasing activity. In terms of you could just really see a marked difference, and that clearly it mattered which party was when it was in the White House in terms of the oil companies being able to get it through to the finish line and actually start developing, because there's a lot of discretion there. So that's one thing they could easily do. And then,
and if they made them long-term leases, that would alleviate some of that regime uncertainty problem.
Right.
Some of it.
Yes. So there's all that involved. As far, I understand what you're saying, and I wish I had a better go-to answer for you. Except again, I think it would be, well, I guess part of it. Oh, I know what I was going to say is, and we can talk about this, and you can give me your pushback if you want. I am open to the idea, even though it does scare me to say this, that in Alaska right now, there is a fund that if you if you become a citizen or a resident of Alaska, maybe you have to be a U.S. citizen, I don't know, you get checks. I think it's an annual thing when they do a disbursement from I think they call it the permanent fund, from the oil that the state administers. And so I know that, and we can link folks in the show notes page, because I did something when I worked for the Fraser Institute. I did a study because they were trying to do something for the province of Alberta to do it similar, and they were looking at Alaska and I think Norway for how they ran their funds because they were doing it better. And anyway, in the Alaska approach, it's they sell the oil and then they just give a lump sum payment to all of the residents. Again, I think you got to prove, you can't just like have lived there for a week or whatever, but it's partly to encourage people to move to Alaska. And it's the reason they do it that way. Part of the rationale is they don't want it just to go into the government coffers. And so the idea is, no, if it's just a payment, it like goes into a fund, and it's called inflation proofing. It's not literally every dollar that comes in goes out to the people, but the idea is it's not just some extra line item in the government's revenue, that it just passes through. And it might even be part of their state constitution, now that I'm thinking about that paper I wrote a long time ago. And so the idea is that it keeps the government's hands off it, and then it builds up a constituency. So now all the people of Alaska are used to getting this check that's based on the oil fund. And so if the politicians mismanage it, or if they want to all of a sudden say, no, for environmental reasons, we're going to, shut this down, and then your annual check went from, I'm making these numbers, went from 2,000 down to 300 because, environmental concern, you know what I mean? Like there might be thousands of people that are upset about that. So that could be one way of doing it, if they could somehow not just make it that, we're going to have this leasing revenue and the deficit, instead of being $2 trillion, is going to be $1.3 trillion. Like nobody cares about that. But if it was just, no, all the money that we're raising from these ongoing leases are just flowing back to the American people. Because, hey, technically, right, the federal government owns this land and these resources, and you're the people, and so that means you own it. And so the lease revenue ought to go to you. If they could, if you could design it that way, then I think there could be more of a constituency in favor of keeping it going. And so especially if the contract was structured such that it was like the winning bidder paid, an entrance fee, and then once they got the thing up and running, then they owed a percentage of the take, to quote the government, but then just went to the people. I think that would provide more long-term certainty, right? Because then once that was up and running, and as long as you got it going during the Trump administration, then if somebody came in and tried to turn it off, then all of a sudden those checks stopped flowing to people. So anyway, I think I've explained to you the mechanics of it, and now I'm curious, like, as your libertarian spider sense is going off, and you're worried about something.
I mean, we're so far away from the ideal. I like anything that makes the incentives, anywhere near closer to being.
Oh, I forgot.
correctly
You're for
aligned.
school choice, so of course you have no principles. Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. Give me the half measure.
Right. Whatever makes me feel better tomorrow. That's what I want.
Yeah, I don't hate an idea like that. Do you have any insight?
Well, can I? Because it sounds like UBI, and I'm against UBI, but it's like, well, no. If it's really, it's not that we're taxing people and redistributing the money. It's
Well, we're starting
in principle,
with it's
it's
an ownership
assets
claim
that the government owns, and that means the people technically own it. And so,
Right.
it's so
we're trying to redesign the ownership claim
Mm-hmm.
away from just something we say semantically to actually being true, that the people do
Mm-hmm.
own this resource and therefore get some of the profits from it. So I'm not one to say where ownership claims are supposed to be distributed. I don't
Mhm.
like the government owning it.
right.
And yeah, I'm fine with half measures if they move in the right direction, as long as you never stop advocating for the true principle of liberty.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so no fight here, Mr. Murphy. Do you do you have any insight, any visibility on the changes either in just the zeitgeist or maybe in the Trump administration as to what they are willing to do about nuclear, about deregulating or tearing down the regulatory restrictions and make it so hard to build
Mm-hmm.
nuclear power? Because we haven't brought up the subject of energy density yet, but you don't get any better bang for your buck as far as energy production than nuclear. We need more of it.
Yeah. So, and that's just as an aside, something that for a long time, a lot of us in this space, call it, have been saying that I don't believe the average climate change activist, because if you really thought we need to drastically reduce carbon dioxide emissions or else everybody's dead in 20 years, you should be a huge proponent of nuclear.
Mm-hmm.
And most of them weren't. Now, in fairness, a few of them were or are. And so those ones I could say, I still disagree about your, climate catastrophism, but at least I believe that you're earnest in it. Whereas the other ones like, no, I just think you don't like capitalism and that this is a kind of a smokescreen for that.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, as far as Rob Bradley has done some work on that. So he's, for people who don't know, he's the founder of the Institute for Energy Research. He's one of, I think, two people that got his PhD under Murray Rothbard. It's because Rothbard at UNLV was not like, that wasn't a PhD granting position he was in, but people who were in other schools that allowed the chair of your committee to be somebody else, like could pick Rob, so that's what Rob did. Rob didn't go to UNLV, but he had Rothbard as his chair. So anyway, one of the things he worked on was like, how do we assess nuclear? And there, the big wild card he thought was the liability.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, in terms of the standard logistics of it and explicit expenses and things like that, nuclear certainly has a role to play. And natural gas, depending on the numbers, natural gas is also lately very competitive also, just because the cost of that has come down so much.
Right.
So anyway, but for, like I said, Rob thought the wild card there is it's hard to, yes, given the government regulation, that was what made it untenable, nuclear, and just to get a reactor approved or whatever, like they made you jump through hoops, and what are you going to do with the spent fuel rods and blah blah blah, and that's why it wasn't being developed. But he wasn't just reflexively saying, oh yeah, so in a free market there would just be nuclear power stations every 10 blocks, because he thought there is the small chance of something going wrong, and then how do you assess that? And so he thought, like in a standard libertarian property rights regime, the owners of a nuclear plant would have to take out big liability insurance policies just on the off chance something went, because if things did go wrong, you're going to cause a lot more damage than just from running a coal-fired power plant or something. So without having more insight into that, he was saying it's hard to say, in other words, he was just not reflexively just saying, oh yeah, nuclear. So anyway, I'm just passing that along for what it's worth, I think that is the stickling point. But other than that, yeah.
No, that makes perfect perfect sense. But I think nuclear technology, while we were sort of sitting on the sidelines, has developed to the point where the things that can go wrong with the earlier designs of a nuclear power plant just can't go wrong like that anymore. Like if they lose power such that they can't cool the rods, instead of melting down, it just turns off.
Right.
Which, yay.
Yep. And good point. And I should be clear, I haven't talked to Rob on this topic for more than a decade. So yeah, it might be that if I caught him now, he would say, oh yeah, stuff's gotten a lot better. I don't know. I haven't talked to him about it. And even there, I think a lot of was it 3 Mile Island? Is that the one?
Yeah.
Like nobody died, right?
Nobody died. No.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things like with these horror stories, and it's not Chernobyl was bad, but that wasn't free market capitalism for you, right?
That
and
was
so
the Soviet Union.
yeah, and then the was it Fukushima? Am I saying that right?
Yeah, Fukushima maybe.
And that was it was like a tsunami hit. That was a kind of a crazy situation.
And it was built all wrong, if I'm remembering correctly. Like it was under the water line or something. And
yeah.
And again, it wasn't one of the modern ones that don't fail like that. Do you have any idea how? I mean, solar and wind, which I view as mostly catastrophes, are so subsidized. And if an executive came in and just wanted to sweep all that away, could he, or would he have to work with Congress? What would have to get undone to get these ridiculous bird-killing windmills off of the horizon?
Well, what's funny is there was this thing called the production tax credit, and every time it came up for renewal, the wind lobby would come in with these infographics just showing how, oh no, if we got rid of the production tax credit, then all this new wind capacity would disappear. And they were like making the case for us. We're like, right, so they're admitting this is completely a creature of the tax code. Like this isn't economic. You know what I mean? Like so anyway, and they're like, well, right, because it's internalizing the externalities from blah, blah, blah. And, haven't you read your mainstream economics textbooks? So to answer your question, yeah, I think if you did reform the tax code and, took a lot of those incentives away. I mean, there's crazy examples of, and this was from several years ago, so the stuff might be dated. I don't know if this is still happening, but there were examples of the wholesale electricity price was negative in certain markets where there was a lot of wind power, and the rationale was just that, like, to earn, people would go and develop wind turbines just for the tax credit. I want to be like, it's a write-off, and you don't even know what a write-off is, but it's a write-off. And so, you know what I mean? Like it was this way that because it was a refundable thing and you could sell it. And so it was like you could start this thing and have this big loss, and then some other company could acquire that and end up, reducing their actual tax liability. All right. So that's kind of how the accounting worked. But anyway, the point was, yeah, there was all these people, but you had to have it operating. And so there were people that they would go ahead and generate electricity with these wind turbines and sell it into the grid at a negative price. They were paying people to take the kilowatt hours from them because that made them qualify, and they earned more by reducing their tax liability that way. So clearly, yes, in general, it doesn't make sense to build a wind turbine and produce electricity and pay people to take it off your hands. That's clearly driven by the tax code. So if that's it, yeah, I think just even taking out a lot of the explicit and implicit subsidies would do a lot. And the looming threat of a carbon tax, which, certainly is not going to happen under a Trump administration. And I don't even hear the left talking about that as much. But for a while, like under the Obama years, that really thought that was going to be imminent. That, oh yeah, we're going to have this big giant carbon tax coming in. And so that was partly why people were building up the infrastructures, because they were looking ahead and think, oh yeah, once that thing's in place, then certainly coal-fired electricity's done, and then even natural gas isn't as competitive, and so that would give more of a room for solar and wind. Having said all that, yeah, there are niches for it. So I do think there would be pockets in the United States where it would make sense to have wind turbines, but not proliferating like they are right now. And then and even solar, again, certain little niche areas, it might make sense to have it, especially like if you want to be off grid.
Right.
Then okay, that makes sense. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I see people in compounds out here in Nevada that,
mhm.
of course, they have their solar, and some of them have their own windmill, and I can see small use cases like that. Um, yeah, but these huge turbines just again killing birds and
And I mean, it's intuitive stuff, but I might as well say it. It has to do partly with the intermittency problem,
yeah, and they
right? If the
break.
sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing, you're in trouble. And so even with all these things where they have it part of like if they have renewable fuel standards and they have all kind of mandates that you got to have a certain percentage of the grid is supplied by these things, they still have to build in that okay, but if it's a hot summer day and the wind's not blowing and it's overcast, then the natural gas fired stuff has to be able to come online to provide it, so everyone's AC can be running, at 5 o'clock at night, the kind of deal on a weekday. So anyway, there's things like that where it's just very inefficient because you have to have the capacity there just in case. And so you have all these different systems that can. So anyway, there's a way, if it were a genuine market, these little niche things could plug in and they could supplement. And
I agree.
there's a way they could do it. Also, a neat thing I've heard, I was just at a digital assets conference, and Bitcoin miners are now coming up with clever ways of, having their operations plugging into a grid so that when electricity demand is down from conventional users, that's when the Bitcoin miners ramp it up.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because it doesn't matter what time of day you're doing your computations. It's just you just got to do a certain amount, per week or whatever to get your yield. And so anyway, that's one way of so adding things to the grid where they can have very expandable or contracting energy uses, which Bitcoin mining is a prime example. Like that's a neat thing. So it kind of is the mirror image of that problem.
Right.
And so anyway, there's things like that.
Yeah, my intuition is if we had a free market in all this stuff, that we'd be burning fossil fuels for 100 or 200 more years at least, and ramping up nuclear energy, because why in the world wouldn't you? And wind would have these niche uses, and solar, I think, would eventually become something we used a lot. But I'm thinking, 500 or 1,000 years in the future, when the technology gets way better, the battery technology gets way better, transmitting energy isn't, it gets much more efficient. It's hard to imagine a long-term future where we're not taking advantage of the free energy being put out by that nuclear furnace up there in the sky. But forcing it so early just seems like a huge waste.
Yeah, and it's funny because wind used to be what they use, like with the
right,
like at the mill or something, and they had or the water too, that was a thing as well, and then the development of fossil fuels, like it's very dense, it's very concentrated, and so that's partly the point. Like, yeah, you put this thing, you put it in your car, and you can drive a long way, and it's a very dense fuel source, and anyway, so that's partly why that happened. It's not that there was a dung tax that was implemented in 1900, and that's why humans switched away from horses into automobiles. And again, it's not that like now people are treating wind as if it's this newfangled technology, and no, like the Dutch had that. Don Quixote was tilting against windmills,
tilting at something.
Yeah. And so it was anyway. You get the point I'm trying to make.
I got a weird question that just occurred to me. We've been talking about the grid, which we have, I guess, because we have governments granting quasi-monopolies to power operators, and so they give us a grid to be wired into. On a free market, would we have something like a grid? And if we didn't, how would we get our electricity? How would that work, do you think?
It's a good question. My guess is original, like back in the 50s and 60s, if the world had gone Rothbardian in the 40s, there probably still would have been large because of the economies of scale, and wiring houses up in this neighborhood, like it all would have been the same energy source, supplier of electricity, and that's what the grid would have been. But I think you're right that as things are getting more nimble and different organizations are arising, that there could be overlapping networks, and that I do see that. I think certainly with a proliferation of total free market entry into this field, it's not necessarily the case that you would think. Just like it's not like, there's the phone network.
Right.
Now, you know what I mean? Like that doesn't even, whereas back in the day, it was like, there's the phone company. And so I think it probably would be like that.
Yeah, I think so too. Just like you've got lots of different bundles of fiber optic cables, running in your house. So we didn't talk too much about policy. Well, we talked about it a little bit. Is there anything you wanted to touch on? I asked you what you'd tell Mr. Wright if you had his ear.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that the federal government is sitting on just a boatload of assets that are identifiable. So I did a thing for Econ Lib years ago where I came up with like $1 trillion of very liquid assets that the government could sell off. This was back during like one of the debt ceiling debates. And I was just saying, like, it's not, you don't have to just raise the debt ceiling. You could just sell off some of these assets and that would give you wiggle room. So I do think that's really what they should be pushing for, because that checks a lot of boxes. That it's returning the resources to the private sector. Clearly, to be developed, it's going to take U.S. labor. You know what I mean? Like if you're developing something that's on U.S. soil, then it's got to take Americans to do. So you think that would be good, and it's bringing in revenue, so they can afford to cut taxes or whatever they want to do. So that's, I think, the main thing I would tell them. And then, just staying out. I don't know. Should we address the climate change stuff at least briefly?
Sure, you might as well.
So I think, ironically, the alarmism of the extreme activists has come back to bite them, in the sense that more than 10 years ago, they have said, if we don't take immediate action, in 10 years is going to be too late. And they've said that so many times that I think people just have tuned them out.
Yeah.
And so there's that element. And so I think at this point, and also just realistically speaking, and I say this knowing I can understand why, if you were a true believer in, climate change is awful and humanity has to come together to stop this. And for me to say what I'm about to say, I get why people would think that's so horribly cynical, but it's the kind of thing where it doesn't really matter what the U.S. does right now. Right. It's China and India. And so there's a sense in which it's kind of goofy, and people talk about, we gotta have leadership, and you can't expect China and India to restrict what they're doing if the U.S. isn't on board. And right, but on the other hand, I think they're gonna do what's in their narrow economic interest. And so I think it's more and more people are starting to realize that, this cat's out of the bag, or the horse has left the barn, or whatever metaphor you want to use. And that's why, they've gone into their different bunkers. And so some people now are talking about geoengineering, like, the only thing we can do now is send up, mirrors into space to reflect some of the incoming sunlight. And there's all kinds of proposals, having algae in the oceans that will absorb the CO2 and sink to the bottom. There's all kinds of stuff. People are. Freeman Dyson had an idea that the physicist, about genetically engineering the trees so that they absorb more carbon. So anyway, there's lots of stuff. So that's why I'm not worried in terms of like, is this really going to end humanity? Suppose you guys are wrong and you're a bunch of idiots and these alarmists were right. There are a lot of technical things that could be done that would buy us 10 more years on the margin. You know what I mean? And so they could do stuff like that, and then there could be a drastic switch over to electric cars or whatever. So anyway, I'm just saying those sorts of things are all feasible. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, give Bill Gates the dials to control the Earth's temperature with, mirrors and space and all that kind of stuff. But I'm just saying, strictly speaking, they could resort to things like that. And that's partly what you see it when the Super Freakonomics book came out, which was like the sequel to Freakonomics.
Mm-hmm.
They had a chapter on this stuff, and the left just went ape, what about it. And I think it's because they wanted to say, no, we can't give people the idea that there's a cheap technological fix, because then that will take away the support for a broad-based carbon tax or cut back with it, forces us to change our lifestyle. So it'd be kind of like if, scientists are working on a pill that will make you lose 50 pounds. And then you can imagine, gym bros being upset by that and saying, no, now people aren't going to change their diet. They're just going to wait for this magic pill that's going to solve it. So I get it, but I'm just saying I think that's kind of where we are right now, that people realize.
People always leave out human ingenuity as part of the equation, because how can you model something like that? But yeah, I mean, I think I've read about a couple different people who invented machines that can literally suck carbon out of the air if need be.
Oh yeah, it's expensive.
It's expensive,
right?
Yeah.
Right. So there's like, it would be cheaper, and economists come in, energy economists, and they say, it would be cheaper instead to plant more trees, or to shift industry away so it's not emitting as much. So on net, it's the same outcome that's just cheaper. But yes, they have developed that. There's prototypes. There's you can go on YouTube and watch videos of it. They're just like big fans that suck the air in, and it absorbs the carbon and takes it out.
Yeah, I'm not convinced at all that the climate alarmists know what they're talking about. Their science does not look like science to me. It looks like a religion. But if they're right, and it is going to be a problem, I think you solve that by being adaptable, and you need wealth to do that. You get richer in order to handle a problem, rather than trying to take yourself back to the Stone Age. I mean, in order to prevent the climate change from happening. I just think that's a totally goofy approach. Get wealthy, then you can handle man-made climate change, volcano-made climate change, sun-made climate change, comets. We have a one-stop shop for fixing human problems, and that's technology, innovation, and wealth. So let's have more of that.
Yeah, Alex Epstein's done a lot on this. Like, he's got a good book on this, and it makes the round. He's a very well-spoken advocate for this. And there's all kinds of charts you can go look at about fatalities from climate events. And that, of course, just drops over time, as people would expect. And it's it makes sense that people can deal with tornadoes. Like now, if a tornado went through a given intensity tornado is not going to kill as many people now as it would have in the year 1900, at least holding population density the same. Like, so there could be more. What happens is, in some of these figures are misleading, there might be like more coastal damage from hurricanes measured in money terms, but that's
bigger
because
houses.
They build more expensive
More
stuff now than was the case in 1950. So there's that element too. But in general, obviously, wealth is health, as they say. So we have a better ability to adapt to things.
Yeah, Alex Epstein's written great stuff on this. I'll put links. I know two of his books, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels and then Fossil Future, are both great. Highly recommended. Well, we're getting close to the end of time, Bob. Got anything else you want to get off your chest?
No, I think that was about it. So like I said, the complete privatization is obviously the first best. I could see people saying that's not realistic or whatever. And so, maybe some leasing program that is tied to a distribution of the booty among the people, and we'll kind of like flip. How, like, I don't know if this is true, but the story is that FDR, when he set up Social Security, wanted it to be ingrained, and said, so now no damn politician can take it away, or something like that. So that's kind of the way, like, to get that certainty, like as you alluded to.
I had another weird question before we wrap.
Okay.
According to, say, Rothbardian principles, homesteading, what do you think ownership would look like for a person who discovered, an oil reserve or a gas reserve or something? Because that stuff goes like There Will Be Blood. Once you stick your straw in there, it goes all over. So how would that work?
Yeah,
I drink your milkshake.
Yeah. So this is literally like partly what was in Rob Bradley's dissertation, is he was,
Interesting.
working this stuff out, and I don't remember off the top of it. So I would point people to that, Rob, again, Rothbard was his chair, and so that's what he was doing. He was taking Rothbard's property rights theory and applying it to the context of oil and gas. I mean, among other things, like he did a lot more in his book than just that. I'm trying to remember the principles he used. Because yeah, it is tricky where you could, a naive view would just be like, well, no, I'm just standing on my, like if I own this, 1 acre square plot of land and I just drill a well, I can certainly, extract oil from it's my land. But what if, if you saw the map and you realize that, yeah, there was this reservoir under the ground that extended miles in either direction. And so in a sense, anybody who drilled down in quote his land would tap into this pool. And then what do you do with that? So I'm going to have to just punt at him and say, I don't remember off the top of my head what Rob did. I thought what he said was compelling, but it's not obvious what the answer would be. And you can't just say, oh yeah, well, if it's your land, you can do it. So it's kind of like raising the question. Okay, but what exactly do you have the rights to do? And yeah, it is more complicated too than simply like, well, can an airplane fly overhead? Is it like, well, if you own this plot of land, do you own the airspace above it to infinity or what? But even there, you could say, okay, whatever the cutoff is, but it's not quite the same with the drilling, because even if you say, oh yeah, you own down to 500 meters below the surface, but if that's tapping into someone else's pool, it's not clear. You know what I mean? Like clearly you can't drill a horizontal well that's underneath your neighbor's, the surface of his property. But if you just by drilling straight down are sucking oil away from what otherwise would have been his, if you didn't do that, it's not obvious how that,
Yeah, I can think of a couple different ways it could shake out, and I'm sort of indifferent. Isn't it like a Kosian thing? It doesn't really matter how the property rights are distributed. They'll eventually
I mean, that's one
in the right place.
Right. So the important thing, and Rob probably even said this, again, it's been years since I've looked at it, but yeah, I mean, so the quick answer would just be the important thing is that we just have some standard. Yeah. And then once you would enunciate that, then people can make, bargains around that. And it's not like the oil's not going to get developed. Like people will come up with.
Because you could certainly make an argument, like, let's say that only one guy in the world knew what oil was. Mm-hmm. And so if he drills, 100 feet underneath somebody else's house, that guy who owned the house wasn't homesteading 100 feet under it. He wasn't doing anything with it. You're not interfering with him at all. It's even less innocuous than an airplane flying overhead. But you could also imagine that if everybody did know what oil was, then we'd have some cultural norm, societal norm, where you apportion it out per each house, take the size of the pool underneath and translate the rights upwards.
Yeah. Well, because what happens, the problem is that, let's say there's 100 homeowners and they're all living in adjacent, like there's a grid, a 10 by 10 grid and there's 100 people on it, little squares. And then there's a bunch of oil under there. There could be a thing where, if they're all just trying to maximize the extraction, that can cause problems and reduce the total amount that humans pull from that deposit.
And you wouldn't want 100 wells, you'd want to coordinate it.
I mean, there's that too. But I'm saying even beyond that, there's and I forget the term for it, but there is a deal where if too many people are trying to drill it and extract it, that causes a problem. Like I don't know if there's a cave in underground. I'm making up terminology. This isn't exactly what the seismologists and geologists call it, but it's but the point being that you don't want to give incentives to do that. That could actually reduce the total take. And so what Rob was proposing, now that this is coming back to me, was a property rights regime such that the default would encourage the optimal thing in terms of maximizing the number of barrels that make it to the surface. And off the top of my head, I don't remember exactly what that rule was, but anyway, that's kind of what he proposed. So that it's not what you wouldn't want, and this is consistent with Coase's approach. You wouldn't want that the default arrangement would be wrong, and so everyone would have to like do contracts to rearrange the property bundles. Like you'd want it to be that the default was kind of like the normal thing that
Right.
would maximize the extraction.
Yeah, which is how it would shake out at least. But yeah, totally. Well, this was fascinating, Bob.
This ended up being more interesting than I thought it was going to be.
It's energy, baby.
Yeah.
What's more exciting than energy? All right. Well, this was great. Depending on where you're watching or listening to this, go to bobmurphyshow.com or YouTube at Haman Nature to check out our other stuff. And also check out hamannature.substack.com. I do some writing there. And thanks, everybody. And thank you, Bob.
Thanks, Ad. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in.